Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, private military contractors as Russia uses mercenaries in conflicts from Syria to Libya, and China steps up efforts to protect its workers overseas. What's the future of war? What's a few $100 billion here and there? Aramco isn't worth $2 trillion, but is the Saudi state-owned oil company relevant? Google and Apple are muscling in on computer gaming with their own platforms. What does that mean for the multi-billion-dollar gaming ecosystem? Well, increasingly, nations are deploying private security contractors to troubled and remote parts of the world, beyond the scope of democratic accountability and operating beyond and around international law. They're proving to be useful agents of diplomacy and proxy wars. But there have been some well-publicised failures. In 2007, Blackwater contractors killed 17 unarmed Iraqis and injured 24 others. Blackwater went on to change its name to Academi and continues to provide services to the Pentagon around the world. Also in Iraq, the Pentagon hired CACI Premier Technology to run the infamous Abu Ghraib prison. The logistics company is alleged to have told military police to soften up prisoners for interrogation. And it's estimated the US government lost as much as $60 billion to fraud by contractors. Right now, the industry is estimated to be worth up to $249 billion. Many nations are deploying mercenaries to reshape battlefields. Russia has used the Wagner Group in Ukraine, Libya, and Syria. As Nicholas Huck reports exclusively from the Central African Republic, Russia is training government forces at the request of the president. Nick was given unprecedented access to their military trainers in Barengo, south of the capital, Bangui.
A staged attack on the grounds of an abandoned palace deep in the Central African Republic. These are masked Russian fighters, some were in Ukraine, others in Syria or Chechnya. Now they're training an army that has lost control of the country after armed groups took over part of this mineral-rich nation the size of France. Vladimir, not his real name, says discipline is one of the problems. Sectarian violence fueled by militia groups has divided Muslims and Christians. The Russians are training men who once fought each other to unite under a government so far too weak to secure its own borders. Valery Zakharov, the special advisor to the country's president, was dispatched by Moscow after President Ouattara called Putin for help.
The aim here is to avoid a bloodshed, so I've travelled the country and met with various rebel leaders to get them around the table.
But in July 2018, 3 Russian journalists were killed in the Central African Republic. They claimed these Russian instructors are in fact mercenaries working for a private security company called Wagner, which has close ties to the Kremlin. The journalists accused them of profiting from the country's minerals. Zakharov denies these claims.
What Wagner? This is just an urban legend. These are Russian reservists, nothing more.
Whatever they are, 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russians are stepping back in the heart of Africa. In October, African heads of state gathered in Sochi. During the event, Russian security firms like Wagner, Patriot, or Shields attempted to lure new business opportunities.
Over 5 years, mutual trade between Russia and various African countries more than doubled to exceed $20 billion. Whether that is a lot or not, my colleague called it great numbers, but I cannot agree. I do not think it's enough. Be aware, dear ladies and gentlemen, $7.7 billion of that comes from trade with Egypt alone, which is about 40% of the total.
At the request of President Ouattara, the Security Council approved imports of Russian weapons last December. Now they're providing both arms and training.
The instruction is happening in Russian, and the soldiers have been trained to understand the Russian language.
At a time when the West, and notably France, the former colonial power, and the United States are retreating, with more weapons and instructors on the way, this may be just the beginning of Russian expansion into Africa. Nicholas Hawk for Counting the Cost, Barengo, the Central African Republic.
Well, joining me now via Skype from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Sean McFate. He's a professor at Georgetown University and the author of the new rules of war. Let's start, if we can, with shady groups like the Wagner Group. Do we know with any level of confidence just who runs it and how close it is to the Russian president?
So the Wagner Group is run mostly by the GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence organization. And its founders and its top leadership are Russian Spetsnaz and Russians with connections to Moscow. But most of the group comes from all over the Russian-speaking world. They're mostly associated with Russian foreign policy, but Russia uses them where they want to, for plausible deniability. So they send them into places like Syria or Ukraine or rumored to be in Venezuela to do things that Spetsnaz or Special Forces or FSB may not want to be caught doing.
How justified then are concerns that these kinds of groups could accidentally start a war between countries? You know the reports I'm referring to of Russian outfits apparently attacking US posts in Syria.
Yes. So in February of 2018, there was an interesting showdown in eastern Syria where 500 mercenaries of Wagner attacked an outpost that was defended by US Special Forces. But it wasn't just any special forces. It was Delta Force, Rangers, Green Berets, Marines, and they called in B-52s, F-15s, Apache helicopters, AC-130 gunships, drones. And this battle lasted 4 hours. 4 hours. In this battle, the American forces killed 200 to 250 Russian mercenaries. But the fact that their 500 mercenaries went up against the US's very best military and it still took 4 hours to beat them back is a cause for concern in case the US has to face 5,000 mercenaries. Fortunately, that day, it didn't drag the US and Russia into the war. But here's the big fear is that if there's it could be accidental warfare and accidental escalation that could suck two powers into a nuclear war that was not anticipated.
It's not only Russia, is it? China's apparently being sucked into the game with the Rotenbelt initiative requiring it apparently to use private security firms too, right?
That's right. So, China's One Belt, One Road initiative is taking them in places of political instability, political insecurity, and they're relying increasingly on private security companies. These companies are thought to be they're Chinese, and they're thought to be an arm of Beijing, sort of like little green men, but little, Chinese green men in many places. But again, there's always a problem of them engaging in a conflict by accident, perhaps, that could suck China or Beijing into a war in a place like the Congo or in the Sahel in Africa or parts of the Middle East. So this is the danger of using mercenaries or contractors, is that they can get in scraps or in fights that suck others into a larger conflict. And sometimes some of these contractors are incentivized by profit to elongate those conflicts for money.
Now, we've seen the use of private security end in scandals, in court cases, in court rulings, but ultimately, how much accountability is there for private armies when you take into consideration, for example, many would argue that Erik Prince, after all that Blackwater went through, he's still in the business?
Right. So mercenaries, accountability and safety of mercenaries has been a problem from the start. And mercenaries, some would say, is the second oldest profession. So how do you control mercenaries? And Erik Prince is a great example. So Erik Prince was the former US Navy SEAL who started Blackwater, which everybody remembers from Baghdad of 2007 when Blackwater killed 17 Iraqis. And there was no accountability. There was no court-martials. Nobody went to jail. Erik Prince, up to that time, said he was a pure American. He'd only work for America. And then suddenly he leaves and now works for China in Africa. And he's in charge of a company called Frontier Services Group, of which China is the major shareholder. He's in Africa these days working on the One Belt, One Road initiative. And he's an example of what a modern mercenary looks like.
Now, to get around some of the rules and laws, we're seeing floating armories being created so that the transfer of arms can take place to some of these groups. Is that creating new legal as well as moral challenges?
Yeah, we don't have a good international framework to deal with modern mercenaries. In fact, our international law is very thin, and the will to enforce it is very small. So we have mercenaries, for example, everywhere in the war in Yemen. Now, who's going to go in and arrest all those mercenaries? Because remember, mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead. So even if you had laws on the books, you still would have a problem enforcing them. And examples of mercenaries, like you say, are floating armories. You also have mercenaries turning drones into kamikazes, making sort of mercenary air forces. We even have cyber mercenaries called hackback companies, and they will hack those who hack you. So mercenaries are expanding in the 21st century, yet we don't have any sort of legal framework or norms to competently deal with this problem.
When you look in your crystal ball, how does the future look? Is the industry set to only grow?
The industry will only grow because there's nothing to stop it. I mean, people, if Russia, the US, and China are using mercenaries, everybody else will eventually too. The extractive industry is looking at them more and more. I'm talking oil, gas, and we're getting to an era, we're going back to the future because in, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, mercenaries were how wars were fought. And this introduces a lot of different problems because that's suddenly you can have wars without states. Anybody who's rich enough to hire mercenaries can become a superpower. So the super rich can become a superpower. And this will change not just warfare as we know it, it will change international politics too.
And what does this tell us about the future of war then? How is that going to change?
Well, it's a great question. Warfare as we know it's going to completely change. So when most people in the West think about warfare, they think about World War II, and they think about the future as World War II with better technology. But the future is not going to look like World War II with better technology. That's sort of Maginot Line thinking. Warfare is going to become a lot more sneaky in the future. Those with money, whether they be oligarchs or multinational corporations or rich states, they can wage war for any reason they want. Like these mercenaries allow you to do, they give you good plausible deniability. So they can create the fog of war. So I think we're going to see war get sneakier and much more diverse around the globe.
All right, thanks so much for your analysis on that.
Thank you.
In the end, it wasn't the blockbuster it was made out to be. Saudi state-owned oil giant Aramco isn't worth $2 trillion US. There's plenty of blame to spread around for such misplaced exuberance. The guarantee of $75 billion in dividend every year for the next 5 years wasn't enough to attract international investors. They couldn't stomach the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's ambitious valuation. But it was a price put together by investment bankers desperate to cash in on the biggest initial public offering of the year. So now the plan is only to sell shares to Saudi nationals and investors from the Gulf region. The value could be as high as $1.7 trillion. But as Aramco becomes a public company, its promise to deliver massive dividend may put it at odds with OPEC, which is trying to boost the price of crude. You may think the two are not incompatible, but they are. OPEC wants to cut production. Aramco needs to sell more oil to pay dividend. Let's pick through some of the issues we've raised with Professor Giacomo Luciano from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, where he runs the Executive Master Program in Oil and Gas Leadership. Well, there's a lot of issues to pick through here. First of all, who's to blame for so badly getting this wrong?
Well, it's always difficult to estimate the reaction of the market. And what the Saudis found is that their initial estimate, the initial estimate that was announced by the Crown Prince now 4 years ago, has not been validated by the market. And
but it's a bit of a really, shall we say, wild overestimate then compared to what the market's willing to pay. The gap's quite big.
Yes, the gap is quite big, and I must say that in the international press, amongst experts, the initial evaluation has always been considered excessive. It is certain to be said that it has been very imprudent on the part of the Crown Prince to announce a price at the very beginning without any, analysis of the market.
Why do you think international investors have been reluctant?
Well, the national investors, I think, also have been reluctant, but obviously the Saudi government has means to encourage them. Both offering sweeteners as they have done, and also putting pressure on them, telling them that it is their national duty to purchase shares in Saudi Aramco.
Well, despite going public, it's a very much state-owned company. Does that put it at odds with OPEC?
Possibly, yes. We have other OPEC companies that are also partially privately owned. The Russian companies, and nowadays Russia is not in OPEC, but it's just as important for OPEC as any OPEC member. The Russian companies also have shares floating on the stock market. So it's something that can be managed, but certainly the investors know that the company is not a pure profit maximizer.
Now, by floating Aramco, is this a move towards transparency and accountability for the company, for the nation, or is that going too far?
Possibly so, but certainly we know today much more about Saudi Aramco than we used to, so there has been a degree of openness and transparency, but whether this will be enough to attract more investors, it is not clear. The domestic public, the domestic investor public is not strong enough to pressure Aramco into substantive greater transparency.
And how relevant is it in a world that's trying to move away from hydrocarbons, in a world where wealth funds are trying to sell off their oil stocks?
Well, yes, wealth funds many wealth funds are divesting from carbon-intensive stocks. But there are plenty of other investors that have other objectives in their investment decisions. So I think other companies are trading well, certainly not as well as the .com companies, but they are trading well. Now, the question is that what was proposed about Saudi Aramco was not on a par with major international oil companies such as Shell or BP or Exxon. All of these are paying dividends which are relatively higher than what was proposed by Saudi Aramco.
All right, good to get your thoughts on this. Thanks so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Alphabet, better known the world over as Google, is using its cloud computing might to muscle into the lucrative video gaming industry. Well, it's been dominated by Microsoft's Xbox, Sony's PlayStation, and Nintendo. But it should come as no surprise. The entertainment industry is worth $135 billion, and by 2025 could be worth $300 billion. Google's Stadia platform will be streamed from the cloud and does away with expensive consoles. Apple will introduce its arcade service. Two of the existing giants of the industry are not taking the challenge lightly. Microsoft and Sony surprised many with a partnership to develop their own cloud solution. It's estimated more than 2.5 billion people play computer games every year, and esports enjoy an audience of 458 million a year. So what does this mean for traditional game developers? Well, I'm delighted to say we have Omar Khan, the co-founder of No Code Studios. No Code is behind BAFTA-winning science thriller Observation, Stories Untold, and Super Arc Light. So what does Stadia Arcade mean for your industry, Omar?
We're seeing more and more services nowadays move to the cloud, and so it's not surprising that we're now starting to see like a sort of games platform just being streamed directly from the cloud.
Is that going to change the way companies like you do business?
I guess for us, we would just look at it as like another potential platform. It's another avenue that you could potentially sell games on. In terms of the way that we specifically make games, some of these developments, they might not have like a huge impact to begin with, because the types of games that we are now actually kind of developing, you might have like 2-3 year cycles. So we are usually kind of looking, yes, we are looking forward to seeing what will be sort of where the future is actually going to be going. But sometimes, especially for us, we were primarily just kind of making good content. That content can then be delivered on lots of different formats. So for example, like we can develop like games for PC, for PS4, for Xbox, and then hopefully that should be able to get kind of ported over to Google Stadia. So in the meantime, we can still produce games in a similar manner than we did before. But it's interesting because it now means that there's another potential outlet that we could potentially sell our games on.
So more business maybe for people like you. Will it hurt the business models, though, talking of business, of PlayStation, Nintendo and so on?
Well, I think that one of the biggest benefits is that you've got the added competition, because now that you've actually got more competition from other players, whether it's Google, whether it's Apple coming in, it then just means that I think like where it will always come down to is the rush to content. Who's got the best content on their platform? That inadvertently is actually kind of good for developers, because it then means that you might see sort of better exclusivity deals for different developers or for different games. Whether that's Sony or whether it's Microsoft or Google or Apple that are actually kind of trying to kind of pay for that exclusive content. And I think ultimately, like gamers, they might not mind so much which platform they actually use, but they want to play the games that they want to play, and so a lot of it will be driven by the content that's on each platform.
Is there still room for startups in the market today to take on some of the big players?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that we've actually discovered as well is that, for us, we're not set out. We don't set out to compete with like the kind of the biggest games out there. We're actually being true to ourselves. We're actually doing games that we know that certainly have like a place in the industry. I mean, it's a huge industry, and when you look at the types of platform, you've got like a huge mobile gaming sector, you've got a huge console gaming sector, PC sector. It's not just about having like huge 100 or 50, 100-hour games. There's so much space in that industry for smaller players to actually sort of coexist. And to a certain extent, yes, you're always competing against any other game that's out there, but there's going to be a huge audience and people that want to play different styles of games. So we just be true to ourselves and say, well, this is the type of game that we know that we can create. We know that we're good at it, and we've now got a track record. So, and that's the thing, is once you start to develop your niche, once you actually start to get good at what you do, then there will be an audience for you. And we've had a lot of really great support from our publisher, a lot of great great reviews from lots of journalists. So that we know that when we actually when we're working on the production for the next game, that we will have like a lot of interest from the very, very beginning. So we don't have to necessarily compete with the kind of the big boys. But having said that, because there's so much room for manoeuvre in the industry, then yeah, there's certainly, and it's a very kind of fast-moving industry. So yes, smaller companies can come up. It's going to be tough to compete with the big studios or that already have like a huge established kind of fan base. But it's the great thing about the industry. People come up with new ideas all the time. The technology is improving. You look at what's going to happen in VR over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, and it's a really exciting space.
What about esports? What potential do you see for that, and what do we learn from the Fortnite competition?
That's going to start to mature over the next few years. It's going to get even bigger. The adoption rate for people going into esports, I think is going to be massive.
All right, thanks so much, Amr Khan.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.